What we have seen is the Ukrainian people ready and willing to stand up to a Russian invasion. And that means that if Vladimir Putin was hoping that this would be a quick, easy invasion, I think the Ukrainian people will give him a rude awakening. They are ready to stand and fight. That inevitably means very significant numbers of casualties, both Ukrainian and indeed Russian casualties. And it will inevitably lead to a movement of people through refugee move across into other parts of Europe, westwards into other parts of Europe. These things are kind of almost inevitable. The way they can be avoided, of course, is by this conflict not to happen. And that's what we're pushing for. That's what I was pushing for at the UN. That's what the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are pushing for at the moment in the Munich Security Conference.
So 5 million refugees is possible?
Yeah, I mean, because it won't just be the people of Ukraine. The other countries in Eastern Europe, some of which are member states of NATO, are watching about what's going on here. And it will be disconcerting if Russia were to invade Ukraine to them. Now, we're seeking to reinforce and reassure our Eastern NATO allies, but the main thing that we're trying to do is to prevent this conflict from happening. And that's what is very much the focus of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, myself, and others in the international community.
Go to someone who knows about all these things. Our first guest, the Foreign Office Minister for Europe and North America, James Cleverly, who joins us now. Good morning, Mr. Cleverly.
Tom, good morning.
Thanks for being with us. Now, of course, you led a debate about Ukraine at the United Nations Security Council in New York last week. Let's talk about Ukraine first off, of course. What does the Prime Minister mean when he's also been talking this morning on the Sophie Rayworth programme? He says that Vladimir Putin is planning the biggest war in Europe since 1945. Now, does that mean that Putin's territorial ambitions extend beyond the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine, perhaps even beyond Ukraine itself?
Well, we don't know fully what is in Vladimir Putin's mind. What we do know is that the largest military force since the Second World War is currently amassed on the borders of a democratic sovereign nation. To the north, to the east, and to the southern border of Ukraine, we have a military force in excess of estimates of over 150,000 troops with combat enablers. And that's the really important thing. Field hospitals, the kind of military logistics that you don't need just for an exercise. There is no credible explanation, and Vladimir Putin has failed to give a credible explanation for this unprecedented amassing of military troops on the Ukrainian border.
Okay, US intelligence assessments this weekend in Washington suggest that a new Russian invasion could leave up to 50,000 civilians dead or wounded and spark a humanitarian crisis of up to 5 million refugees spreading out west through Europe. Does the UK government share that kind of assessment?
Well, one of the strong advantages of our relationship with the United States of America is we share lots of intelligence with each other, and that is very, very credible intelligence. What we have seen is the Ukrainian people ready and willing to stand up to a Russian invasion. And that means that if Vladimir Putin was hoping that this would be a quick, easy invasion, I think the Ukrainian people will give him a rude awakening. They are ready to stand and fight. That inevitably means very significant numbers of casualties, both Ukrainian and indeed Russian casualties. And it will inevitably lead to a movement of people through refugee move across into other parts of Europe, westwards into other parts of Europe. These things are kind of almost inevitable. The way they can be avoided, of course, is by this conflict not to happen. And that's what we're pushing for. That's what I was pushing for at the UN. That's what the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are pushing for at the moment in the Munich Security Conference.
So 5 million refugees is possible?
Yeah, I mean, because it won't just be the people of Ukraine. The other countries in Eastern Europe, some of which are member states of NATO, are watching about what's going on here. And it will be disconcerting if Russia were to invade Ukraine to them. Now, we're seeking to to reinforce and reassure our Eastern NATO allies. But the main thing that we're trying to do is to prevent this conflict from happening. And that's what is very much the focus of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, myself, and others in the international community.
If Russia does invade, and we may know very soon indeed, will the British government continue to arm Ukrainian forces as we have been doing over the last few weeks and months?
Well, actually, we've been working with the Ukrainian armed forces for a very extended period of time, for years, in fact, through Operation Orbital. We've supplied defensive military equipment and the training in the use of that equipment. The Ukrainian military is large, it's well resourced, and it would absolutely put up a very, very credible defense against a Russian invasion. We seek to support Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine. They are a democratic country. They're a sovereign nation. And if we collectively are not willing to stand shoulder to shoulder with other democratic sovereign states in their self-defense, then we send a very, very corrosive signal to the world. I think the Prime Minister made that absolutely clear.
I think the question I think you're answering is yes. I asked, would you continue to arm the Ukrainian military if Russia invades? You seem to be suggesting that you will.
Well, the decisions as to exactly what that support would be are yet to be taken and will be defined by the circumstances as they unfold. But the point is that we have supported Ukraine.
I know you have been doing, but here's the thing.
We will continue.
So you'll continue to support the Ukrainian armed forces because, of course, this is all part of the deterrent package, isn't it? If you say this, if you generally believe you can and will continue to arm the Ukrainian military, perhaps that might just put Putin off invading.
Well, what Vladimir Putin has to understand is that this will not be a quick and easy conflict. This will come. It would be a. We've used this phrase before, but it's absolutely the case. It would be a huge strategic error.
I understand.
There'll be Russian fatalities. There'll be Russian body bags going home to families in Russia that will inevitably be deeply, deeply unpopular. Russian soldiers dying.
What I'm wondering is what the British government is going to do when this conflict begins, if it begins, and you don't seem to be able quite to say just yet.
Well, I tell you, one of the things that we have done, and our response would not necessarily be limited to this, but one of the things we have done is put the most extensive sanctions regime in place so that we can go after the money people.
Let's get to that.
Vladimir Putin.
Let's get to that, Mr. Cleverly, because I was just asking about arms, and it doesn't sound like you're ready to go there quite yet. Now, the Prime Minister, speaking in Munich yesterday at the Security Conference, said allies need to speak with one voice to stress to President Putin the high price he will pay. That really felt to me a warning that one voice hasn't been spoken with perhaps quite yet. And how frustrating is it that all our international partners are not quite yet saying the same thing to Russia on that package of sanctions if there is an invasion, for example, on building Nord Stream 2 or ending Russia's involvement in the SWIFT banking system?
Well, we work very closely with our international partners, both in Europe and across North America, in making sure that we are coordinated in our response. I know the Foreign Secretary has been involved in many of those meetings. I've been involved in a number of those meetings, making sure that we provide a package of sanctions that will have a real impact on Russia, but also we make sure that we support each other as allies because, President Biden made this case, that the imposition of sanctions will also have some corresponding pressure back on the countries imposing those sanctions. We're ready to accept that and make sure that Russia understands that collectively we stand together. Collectively, we will impose meaningful, painful sanctions on those individuals and entities in Russia that support the regime and that are facilitating this conflict or this potential conflict in Ukraine.
You see, that's not quite the way Ukraine's president sees it. President Zelensky also in Munich yesterday accused some countries in the West of appeasement of Russia. Is he wrong?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to criticise the democratic leader of a country that has an army amassed on its borders. Understandably, the Ukrainians feel under a great deal of pressure, and what we have done in the UK with others, but the UK very much in the lead, has demonstrated to Ukraine that we support them, we stand shoulder to shoulder with them, that we will act to deter this aggression, meaningfully deter this aggression, which means those troops moving away from the border, moving back to their barracks, moving back to the to the cities far to the east of Russia where they have come from. And until and unless that happens, we will keep imposing this diplomatic pressure on Russia. And if an invasion were to take place, then of course we will not hesitate in imposing those sanctions.
That I understand. The question is posed by the president of Ukraine himself, President Zelensky even. Has the West done enough so far or not? It's kind of binary. You must have a view.
Well, every day that Russian tanks and troops do not cross the border is a good day. Now, until those troops disperse, the job certainly is not done. And having that army on the Ukrainian border, intimidating Ukraine, trying to destabilize the Ukrainian economy, pumping disinformation into the public sphere, until that stops, this will not be, none of us can claim that this is resolved. But ultimately, our primary aim is to prevent that conflict, which is sadly still very credible, still very likely, and still imminent, potentially. That's the focus at the moment. And that's what we will continue to do, as I say, until those troops disperse.
Okay, you just mentioned the need for some Western states to take a bit of a hit themselves if they're going to impose sanctions on Russia, financial sanctions. I think that's an obvious quid pro quo. For the UK to do meaningful sanctions on Russia, it would mean, would it not, stopping the financial centre of our country, the City of London, just outside of our window here at Times Radio Towers, the other side of London Bridge, from servicing big Russian state companies, providing lawyers, providing banking to the likes of Rosneft, Gazprom, because that would really hurt the Kremlin. Is that somewhere the British government is prepared to go to?
Well, the Prime Minister has, he's made the point that we are absolutely ready to look at and address the Russian oligarchs and those money people around.
It's not quite oligarchs, Mr. Clevey. These are Russian state-owned companies, huge companies, and getting a lot of financial help from the City of London. Can that continue?
So our sanctions regime covers both individuals and entities. That means organisations. I won't go into the detail of what sanctions specifically might address, because, of course, to do that would give the opportunity for the institutions and individuals perhaps to move their money. But ultimately, our statement, the legislation that I put to the House last week is, just before recess, is absolutely clear. We will go after both the individuals and the institutions that support Vladimir Putin.
Like Gazprom. Like Gazprom and Rosneft.
I'm not, and we never do this, we never are explicit about where sanctions might fall, because to do so would be counterproductive. We never do that. But we have made it clear that we've expanded the scope of our sanctions regime so that we can go after individuals and commercial entities that are propping up the regime in Moscow.
Let's move on to COVID, because there's a big piece of government work being published tomorrow, the Living with COVID strategy. Now, a little bit has been announced overnight. Quite a lot has been trailed from this. It certainly has been announced, one thing, that the legal duty on individuals who test positive for COVID to self-isolate will end this week. If that happens, it's no longer mandatory to stay at home for 5 days or 10 days if you have COVID. Should people still isolate if they have it, whether it's legal or not?
Well, what the plan ultimately is to get back to the normal set of kind of habits and personal responsibility that we apply to most other diseases. Now, obviously, individual circumstances vary, but typically it's not a good idea if you're ill and you think you've got a contagious disease to go and mix with other people in the workplace. That's the situation that we've had, whether it be for the common cold or flu or any other contagious disease.
And that's what you'll be encouraging people to do, to stay at home if they have COVID.
So what we're saying is we're getting back to the point where people take sensible, pragmatic decisions, where they take responsibility for their own actions and the responsibility towards their friends and neighbours. This is the normal way that we deal with diseases and have done in British society, rather than having the kind of strict regulations imposed centrally by government. That's the right thing. That's what we want to get back to. And actually, the fantastic rollout of the vaccine programme and our booster programme means that we've broken the link between infections and hospitalisations. The Omicron is much more similar to other diseases which we have got used to circulating in society,
Okay.
and we do ultimately want
Let me just ask you
to.
about a couple of details about this because people really do care about it. It really does matter. There's been a lot of chat about ending all free testing from everybody this week, lateral flow tests as well as PCR tests. Is that going to happen?
Well, the detail of this, you'll have to wait for the statement. I don't want to preempt that. But as I say, ultimately, what we're looking to achieve is to move back towards the normality that we lived with prior to COVID. The details of how we go about that, the pace, that will come in the statement. I'm not in the position to preempt that.
Okay. On the general principle of getting back to normality, that is what everybody, I'm sure, wants. But you also have to concede, I think, there is a huge amount of medical worry, voices of doctors, voices of scientists, SAGE, getting extremely worried about what might be happening, the end of all restrictions right now. We've spoken to the WHO's Special Envoy, Dr. David Nabarro, already this morning. Now, he has said something quite interesting. I just want to play it to you right now. Have a quick listen to this.
In the circumstances, I think it's really rather dangerous to be moving down this path. The Royal College of Nursing saying it's a leap in the dark, that seems to me quite a good way of describing it. For me, it's a gamble. And I would just say to everybody, is this gamble really worth it? Or is it one that perhaps is just going a bit too far?
It's a leap in the dark, Mr. Cleverly. It's a gamble. What do you say?
Well, it is completely understandable that medical professionals stay primarily focused on the medical implications of decisions. Ultimately, the job of government is to balance the epidemiological situation, the other health considerations, the social considerations, economic, educational considerations. The job of government is to balance all these various inputs. So it's understandable that medical professionals focus predominantly on the medical side of things. But ultimately, what we have seen is a world-class vaccine and booster rollout, which has meant that we are much better protected against the variations of coronavirus than we were at the start of this pandemic. We're seeing that we've broken the link between infections and hospitalizations. And ultimately, what we do need to do now is get back towards living with this disease, just as we live with other contagious diseases. That's not to say that that we pretend this doesn't happen or that we ignore it. Far from it. We'll still be very careful. We've got world-class genomic sequencing. We would absolutely be keeping an eye on how these things evolve, but ultimately we cannot press the pause button on our lives indefinitely.
Okay, there is another way of looking at this. Some of your critics are saying this as well. In fact, some of those health voices we've been hearing, they think this isn't about the science, this isn't even about getting the economy back up and running. This is all about the Prime Minister trying to get out of the intensely difficult political spot he's in with Partygate and trying to appease his libertarian backbenchers, and he's rushing things.
Well, the simple fact is that the figures speak for themselves. We've got a world-class vaccine rollout. We've got a fantastic booster program. That has led to the fastest growing economy in the G7. That economic growth provides the tax revenues which we will then be able to plough into the NHS to get to start responding to the backlog of elective surgery that has inevitably been a byproduct of coronavirus. These are the decisions that we have to make in government. It's about balancing things. And actually, what we have seen is the Prime Minister and the team around him on these big decisions, often in the face of criticism from whether it be other political parties or elsewhere, have got these big decisions right. That's why we're seeing this economic growth. That's why we're seeing the breaking of the link between infections and hospitalizations. And that is why we are now in a position to step back towards normality, which I think at heart is what everybody really wants.
Mr. Cleverly, it's Daisy McAndrew here. Good morning to you. Very interesting listening to your chat with Tom there. And I just want to pick up on something that certainly in my chat earlier with Professor Nabarro and other members of the medical community, they are very concerned about, which, as you quite rightly say, we have in this country have world-class genomic sequencing. And one of the reasons we have that is because of the ONS survey, the COVID survey, which itself is considered to be the gold standard internationally. And it does randomised tests so that it can pick up on variants. And if we are to have the so-called Freedom Day, obviously we've got to keep an eye on mutations and variants in case we do need to, put the genie back in the bottle and put new restrictions in place if we do get a variant. But the rumours are that ONS survey is going to be stopped, and that is concerning a lot of people in the medical community. Can you reassure us today that that is just a rumour and is not the case?
Well, as I say, the details of what is staying, what's changing will be set out to House of Commons tomorrow, and I don't really want to preempt that. What I would say is that we still have a huge amount of testing that goes off completely independent, so that ONS random sample testing. And actually, this is, as I say, this is what we do with other diseases. Influenza mutates and changes, and we get updates for that. And the vaccination program for flu changes each year in response to those mutations. This is what we do with other diseases, and what we're saying is that ultimately we have to move back to a sustainable, a socially sustainable, economically, medically sustainable balance. That's what we're looking to do, and we're able to do this because we've got the big decisions right. The Prime Minister and his team have got the big decisions right about lockdowns, about rollouts, about vaccinations, about boosters. That's why we're in a good place, both medically and with the fastest growing economy in the G7 economically.
Okay, a lot of waiting and see. We'll have to wait and see tomorrow then what really happens. Mr. Cleverly, one final question. Now, we know the Prime Minister has returned his questionnaire about Downing Street parties to the Metropolitan Police. That happened on Friday night. We'll find out soon what the Metropolitan Police think they should do about that. But just to be clear, if the Prime Minister does receive a fixed penalty notice, I understand that you believe it is okay for him to stay on in his job no matter what.
Well, what I've said is that it's not really particularly useful speculating as to what may or may not happen. But the point is, so for all the reasons we've been discussing on the programme today, the Prime Minister is doing a very effective and incredibly important job. We have a potential war in Ukraine. We have the economic and medical response to COVID that we need to deal with. There are plenty of things that he has been and is focusing on. That's what I think he should continue doing.
With or without getting a fixed penalty notice, he should continue his job. Just to be clear.
Well, as I say, I said I don't think that now would be the appropriate time for us to start thrashing around for a new leadership. I think the Prime Minister has been doing an incredibly effective job, as we have seen evidenced in our economic and medical response, and I think that's what he should continue to do.
Just to be clear, though, that would, of course, mean the Prime Minister staying in his job if he receives a fixed penalty notice, having broken the ministerial code, which would be to comply with the law at all times. It's a lot of ifs there, a lot of ifs, but you've just answered an if, so it's okay for him to stay in office having broken the ministerial code.
So you're putting all these conditional questions, and the point I said right at the start is I'm not going to speculate. What I am saying is the Prime Minister has and is doing an incredibly effective job, as is evidenced by our economic recovery, by our vaccine rollout, by the way that we have dealt with, or that he and the team have dealt with coronavirus, which has allowed us this journey back to normality.
Okay, I think your views are clear. Mr. Cleverly, Foreign Office Minister for Europe and North Africa, we're very, very grateful for your time this morning. You've been very generous with it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Daisy.